So who's ever watched a Draw My Life video? Anyone? Well, what we're gonna do is draw out the life of a sort of complex. No, not a social or mental complex, but rather an economic complex. The Military-Slave-Coinage Complex, or MSC for short. So what this is the government having an idea to solve debt. They mint coins from precious metals and create markets. These coins are put into circulation so people can pay their debts. Governments, however, realize that these coins are a good way to fund and motivate their armies. So now power hungry and money hungry, governments now have the manpower to pursue personal interest. They go on military conquest and proceed to loot, enslave, and tax foreign populations. The king, realizing that they need more coinage to fund further conquest, put these captured slaves to work in mines to produce coinage that can be redistributed into the markets. The system only works if it keeps moving. Once one aspect stops, everything else does. Let's skip forward to an example of this complex in the early civilizations. Besides being known for tzatziki, souvlaki, yelling opa, and throwing plates, Greece is also known for its development of democracy. And while we all like voting and freedom's great, it all isn't pretty when it comes to the development and maintenance of early democracy. It all started when the Greeks overthrew their aristocratic leaders when they were not ruling in favor of the people's interest. Once the aristocratic rule was overthrown, the Greeks would create a democracy in which people would come together to make decisions. The leaders of this new democracy were demagogues, and in order to maintain their power and legitimacy, they would have to compensate people in participating in juries and assembly. The example of Athens versus Milos illustrates democracy taking part of the MSC. After their conquest of Milos, the people of Athens decided a massacre should take place if the Melians refused to become tributary-paying subjects, and that it was in the best interest of both parties for this conquest to happen. The Melians weighed their pros and cons, and decided that it was in their best interest to stay alive. They performed labor that the middle and higher classes wouldn't perform, including working in coinage-producing mines. The newly created wealth would fund even more military conquests that would produce even more slaves and a continued growth of wealth that would sustain Greek democracy. As we can now see, the Military-Slavery-Coinage Complex was fundamental for this Greek ancient democracy. If you flip a coin right now in Canada and it lands on heads, you're going to see a picture of a lady with a crown. This is the Queen of England, and her being on our money is an example of the lasting impact of the Military-Slavery-Coinage Complex from the colonial period. Let's go ahead and draw a terrible map. So we have North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. Let's zoom in on the industrial part of Europe, with Spain and England. Europe started to become heavily militarized and industrialized as a result of gold discovered in the New World. In order to increase yield and profit within their domestic industry, Europeans began to use slaves. For example, the Spanish set out and captured colonies in South America and used the indigenous population as slaves to work in mines in order to extract gold. The introduction of gold from the New World changed everything. Europeans were now wealthy enough to support a booming slavery industry in Africa. They dispersed explorers to capture new slaves to further exploit the New World for profit. The slaves would then mine raw materials to be sent back home to be made into finished goods. These goods would then be traded domestically in markets for a profit, as well as globally for a return of more slaves who would subsequently be sent to work in the New World. The discovery of the New World is a perfect example of how the introduction and growth of money leads to high militarism and slavery. It represents the transition from early Greek democracy exploiting the MSC and towards the modern-day Western version of economics. Nowadays, everything needs to be politically correct. It's no longer Merry Christmas or Happy Hanukkah, it's Happy Holidays. It's no longer a Christmas tree, but a holiday tree. So we shouldn't be surprised that the West has turned globalization into the politically correct word for the MSC. The West, in the interest of capitalism, ventures into the global South. They cross these borders to set up multinational corporations that at times violate human rights through seeking the cheapest labor. We see coinage in pursuing capitalism, military in crossing over borders, and a type of modern-day slavery emerging in multinational corporations where people are paid poorly and subject to terrible working conditions. We see this happen in sweatshops like maquiladoras in Mexico. Another example of this process is Shell Oil in Nigeria, where Shell funds Nigerian army forces to protect MNCs as well as to prevent riots and protests from occurring. That's a terrible Shell. Even international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank take part of this exploitive process. These institutions profit off the developmental process and place the Global South in positions where their lent money has interest rates that are impossible to repay, or they tie the debtors' economic policies in ways that benefit the MNCs in the area, rather than socio-economic progress for the country. Moving forward, globalization has implications. According to the UN, 20% of the world's population owns 94% of the world's wealth. Of the world's 100 largest economies, half are corporations. And the 6th largest corporations in the world have revenues greater than the countries containing half the world's population. In short, this is a system that produces cheap labor, exploitation, and a high militarized environment, an exploitive system eerily similar to civilizations over 1,000 years ago. Since the MSC never stopped, it kept evolving throughout history. It adapted and made its way from the early period to colonial times all the way to modern day economics.